I'd like to share with you some thoughts about America, American independence, and what America has meant to the world and hopefully will continue to mean to the world on this July 4th. To appreciate what is so unique and what was so powerful that it altered the course of human history, hopefully forever, about America, you need to understand the historical context in which America created itself. The time period in the 17th, 18th century, the Western world anyway, was being dominated, as was much of the East, by monarchies, by aristocracies, serfdom. The people had little to no representation. On top of that, you had oppressive religious structures in many parts of the world, where theocracies, or as was the case with the church, they didn't necessarily rule over particular countries so much as they had a very disproportionate influence in decision-making, in political appointees, and even in many of the wars that were conducted from the Crusades and on. The Protestant Reformation and the fighting actual wars that followed were pretty much in full swing, and many of these early American colonialists were people who were fleeing persecution from places like France. You had the Huguenots. From Germany, England had its own fighting regarding the church and how divorce was viewed, among other issues. Holland as well. I live in Bergen County, New Jersey, which was largely populated by Dutch immigrants in the 17th and 18th centuries. So the context of the creation of America was that decisions were being made for the people by other people, by people who wielded power, by people whose power was not to be questioned or tinkered with, and people that did not have the right or the power to appoint or to disappoint. Punishments were swift, justice was crooked, and always serving the powers that be, as it generally does. And America and the American idea were that democracy ought to be more direct, perhaps as direct as possible, that even if a representative government were necessary, compromises should be made to account for the smaller, more densely populated states versus the larger, more sparsely populated, largely agricultural states. And the Bill of Rights was ratified shortly after the Constitution in order to make sure that very, very basic rights, basic human rights, as the founding fathers saw, were to be preserved, were to be committed to posterity in the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, and that these rights were to be inalienable, as more or less pointed out in the Declaration of Independence. We today, in the year 2024, fail to appreciate the context in which America was founded. We fail to appreciate the precious rights that this form of government afforded the people, and that is why we fail to appreciate how rapidly the political climate has changed and how much less has been left to us from our constitutional heritage, how quickly these rights are being eroded. American values were first and foremost the individual's right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, every individual taking responsibility for him or herself, everyone being equal in the eyes of the law, and then naturally people having the right to speak freely, to practice freely, the First Amendment, freedom of the press, freedom of association. I can sell to whomever I want, I can buy from whomever I want, I can refuse to sell to whomever I want or refuse to buy from whomever I want. I have the right to speak freely, as do others. And that compels us to understand that it also serves as a responsibility on the part of the individual to hear speech that we may not agree with, that we may not even care for. I have to tolerate the speech of others in order to preserve the sanctity of the freedom of speech that I'd like to enjoy. And the same goes for religion. As long as no one's forcing it upon you, you have the right to practice. As long as you're not abrogating or violating anybody else's rights, you practice your religion, or practice no religion at all, or practice anti-religion, as long as it's not forced or foisted on anyone. and I can practice as freely as I wish. I say this in particular from my own perspective as an American and an Orthodox rabbi, where I believe the Jewish people most particularly need to appreciate and understand how crucial America has been to our people's development, growth, safety, and ultimately the flourishing American Jewish population and the American-Israeli relationship, which I think is not to be taken for granted. We all understand that political landscape is currently in a shift of one form or another. Many of us may not remember the name Hayim Solomon. Definitely worth looking up. Feel free to Google or Wikipedia him. He was born in Poland, albeit to a Sephardic family, came to the U.S. and banked everything he had as a financier on the American Revolution. He was arrested twice by the British, both times managed to escape. He borrowed and lent everything he could in order to help finance the revolution, which began in 1776, didn't end until 1781. And he died at the age of 44, penniless, with all the notes that he was holding worth less than 10% what they were worth when they were issued. So he was upside down, as it were, on all of those loans, and he left his family nothing. Hayim Solomon believed so strongly that the values that the founding fathers of this country stood for and were willing to fight and die for were values that he, as a human being, and in particular as a Jew, should be giving his full support and standing behind 100%. It wasn't just money and cutting checks. It wasn't just guaranteeing loans. Hayim Solomon was arrested for espionage by the British and judged to be executed. His escape was a miracle, and it was a miracle that allowed him to help finance the war and see it to its completion. George Washington interacted with him. There was correspondence back and forth. He wanted to give him a particular note of thanks when the country declared its independence and ultimately went on to establish itself as a sovereign nation. Hayim Solomon asked for nothing by way of personal recognition. Maybe gently he said that he requested that his people be recognized somehow, because he realized that America offered this promise of opportunity that no other country in the world had offered. The Jewish people lived under the thumb of what was at the time Catholic Europe. Protestant Reformations were a mixed bag for the Jews. Martin Luther in the beginning maybe looked up to the Jews and even borrowed from some of the commentaries. Rashi most notably, and later apparently felt betrayed that the Jews didn't embrace the reform and took a less favorable view towards them. Catholic history, unfortunately, is rife with official and unofficial acts of anti-Semitism, laws that were passed that were bigoted and biased. And in the Muslim world, things were oftentimes just as bad, if not worse. Both the Catholics and the Muslims attempted forced conversions on various Jewish populations, famously in 1492 under Ferdinand and Isabella, when Europe, with the help of Spain, France, Portugal, support of the Vatican, was able to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula and expel the Moors who had dominated the region for 5 centuries. The ultimatum was given that everyone living there who wasn't Catholic at the time should either be baptized or be expelled. All of the Muslims, the overwhelming majority of the Muslims left, and the overwhelming majority of the Jews went along with them. My own ancestry ended up in Morocco as a result. The Moors realized that if they were the reason that the Jews were being expelled, the least they could do would be to extend them safe passage into their own countries. At the time, the Ottoman Empire was coming up, and so many Jews ended up living under the Ottoman Empire in relative peace, but it varied from ruler to ruler and from country to country. I say this because the turn of events, especially since this past October 7th, 2023, has led a lot of people to draw some very interesting conclusions, and oftentimes diametrically opposed to the founding principles of this nation. While it's true that there are many people who hate the Jewish people, who threaten, and who actually physically attack, unfortunately this has become an almost daily occurrence, especially in Europe. In Israel, we've been living this for some time. The reality of the matter is that anti-Semitism is no different from any other form of hatred, certainly not in the eyes of the law. Attempting to control people's speech or people's right to speak freely is very, very different from calling out the speech for what it is. I believe it was Justice Antonin Scalia and Judge Andrew Napolitano, both of whom have made comments to the effect of the only safe place for hate speech is right out there in the middle of the public, where it can be identified and ridiculed for what it is. Hate speech ought not to exist, but it does. And the only responsible response to hate speech is to point out its flaws, to point out the hatred, the racism, and the bigotry that engender it, and to defeat it on wisdom, on consistency, on logic, and on humanity. Attempting to suppress people's right to speak freely will not change the way they feel about anyone or anything. It may drive it underground for a time, but I heard this quote recently, I believe it was the name of an Irish writer, that anti-Semitism is a light sleeper, and it's very easily awoken. Driving it underground will not change the reality. The First Amendment afforded the Jewish population of the United States the right to own land, the right to engage in whatever businesses they chose to, the right to either send their children, when public schools were created in the 19th century, to send their kids to public school or to private school, to practice religion freely, and to conduct themselves socially, commercially, politically, as members of any other members of society would be allowed to. This was an unprecedented historical blessing, and one that I fear was taken for granted. Because although anti-Semitism has been around for probably as long as the Jews themselves, the rights that this country, its Constitution, and its Bill of Rights afford us come along with responsibilities. The responsibilities are that we obviously respect and appreciate other people's right to speak freely and to express themselves. It doesn't mean we need to accept what they have to say. We need to accept the right that they have to say it. We can call them out, and we should. We can call out phony, fallacious ideas. We can call out slanderous speech. We can call out racism. We can call out bigotry. Every citizen has an obligation to identify these things, to call them out, and to put them in their proper place, which is the compost heap. That said, I do not stand for people believing that they have the right to muzzle or to suppress other people's freedom to express themselves. It is not the American way. I don't believe that there should be any groups who have the right to put violations of their emotions or feelings above the rights of anyone else. That's not to say that someone calling for the death of Jews is only hurting their feelings, but it is to say that such people, especially if they do intend to act on such speech, basically offer law enforcement the warrants they would need to go ahead and prosecute like any other threat of a crime, and to let the wheels of justice turn as they do, sometimes painfully slowly, but ultimately they catch up. This brings me to the Second Amendment. It is not my belief, and it certainly was not the belief of the founding fathers of this country, that any individual living in it be obligated to entrust his or her personal safety, or the safety of their families or livestock or belongings or property, specifically to the police or to any militia. One of the most revolutionary concepts in the American Constitution is that the individual's right to bear arms is so enshrined in the Constitution as to be worded specifically in the negative that the government does not have the right to infringe on the individual's right to bear arms. The necessity of the militia referring very obviously to the need from time to time to keep the government in check. Remember the context in which America was founded. People weren't using their weapons specifically to hunt for deer. The question was, how much can we trust the British government, or for that matter, any other government that might come afterwards? Remember, we had basically already won the Revolutionary War. What's this need for a private, or individual militias? The answer is simple, so we don't get fooled again. The American government itself may one day become tyrannical, and people should have the right to defend their rights. Because rights that you can't defend and rights that you can't exercise do not exist. Any right that you cannot exercise freely, and any right that you can't defend, or that you have to defend your right to exercise, is slowly but surely being deleted out of existence. So it has been said before that the First Amendment is one of the most basic freedoms the Constitution affords its citizens. The Second Amendment is necessary for the first. There may come a time, and for all I know it may be soon, where your right to exist may be called into question, and you may need to defend yourself. And you are not responsible or required to wait for the police to show up. You are not required to wait for the wheels of justice to turn. If someone's threatening your life, you have the right to respond right away. This right was considered to be so basic that it was enshrined in the Bill of Rights. America as a nation openly encouraged, and in many parts of the country still does, most of them in fact, still encourages the citizens to procure, to train, and to bear arms. Your personal safety is your utmost responsibility. And it falls in line with the Protestant work ethic in much the same way. Your personal welfare is your responsibility. I believe it was Benjamin Franklin who once said, the Constitution only guarantees you the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit itself is on you. You do need to protect yourself. You do need to protect your rights. You do need sometimes to assert yourself. And if aggressed, you most certainly do have the right to respond. Often enough, the police only come to collect evidence, to take pictures, and to zip up body bags. That is not the fate that the founding fathers of this country saw for its citizens. So it's a bit of a call to arms, so to speak, in the sense that I do firmly believe that every citizen ought to learn to be proficient in the use of firearms for the purpose of self-defense, hunting if you so please. But I absolutely do believe that one of the greatest things about this nation was that these freedoms were laid out, committed to posterity in writing, ratified as law, and that your right, indeed your responsibility, to protect and to defend these rights, even with the use of lethal force, should it prove necessary, was foreseen 250 years ago. They had such amazing foresight and such amazing insight that they knew the time would come where no matter how many times these rights were written, ratified, and signed into law, they would ultimately be called into question. And if those questions are violent or physical in nature, the answers may be too. So it goes. No one promises you an easy ride through life. No one promises you anything's going to be fair or right or just, and sometimes matters need to be taken into your own hand. So by all means, celebrate this July 4th by practicing freely whatever religion or non-religion you choose to practice. Speak as freely as you wish. Associate with whomever you'd like. And maybe you do, depending on your state and your municipality, either with a permit or without, procure a firearm, learn how to use it, keep yourself, your loved ones, your friends, your family, and your community safe so that they can go on to continue and pursue life, liberty, and happiness. Happy birthday to America. God bless us all.